Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Burges Watson, and today our focus is on China's largest ever military parade. We'll be asking, what message is Beijing sending out? And how's all this being viewed by Washington? All of that to come. Hello and welcome to the programme. Straight to Beijing, where laser weapons, nuclear ballistic missiles, even robotic dogs were all on display at what was China's largest ever military parade earlier on today. Well, the event marked 80 years since Japan's surrender in the Second World War, and according to analysts, that carefully choreographed event sent out a clear message. China is showcasing its might, positioning itself as the world's next global leader and possible counterweight to the United States. Let's take a closer look. Well, ahead of that parade in Beijing, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the North Korean leader Kim Jong stood shoulder to shoulder for the first time in a long time. That was a striking image for the world, and one that the US President Donald Trump did not let pass. On social media, President Trump addressed President Xi directly, writing, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." Well, we can cross now to Washington and get some analysis from Greg Swenson, who is chair of Republicans Overseas and a friend of this channel. Greg, a pleasure talking to you as always. We've been talking there with our previous guest about China's largest ever military parade, which some are saying was not so much a commemoration of the end of the Second World War, more of a sort of superpower coming out party. That's how some people have described it. How's Washington viewing this?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, Tom, as you pointed out. I mean, yes, it is the commemoration of the defeat of Japan, but if that was really a commemoration for the end of World War II, the United States would have been involved as the obvious leader of the Allies, and really the basically the mechanic of the defeat of Japan, quite obviously. So no, it's China flexing its muscles, that's for sure. And I think that, that's acknowledged here in the U.S. It's not surprising to anybody because, we've seen China as an adversary for, 8 or 10 years now.
Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary looking at the images of Tiananmen Square earlier today. I mean, real Cold War style imagery, military hardware on display, soldiers goose-stepping, President Xi in the middle, flanked by Kim Jong-un and President Putin on the other side. And clearly, President Trump didn't like what he was seeing because he said a message, it seems, to President Xi on social media, "Please give my regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." That's what he put on social media. I mean, he's not sounding happy at all about what he's been seeing coming out of China.
No, I think that's right, Tom. And look, the president is very blunt. He's very candid. He's very transparent. So that's what everybody's thinking. So why not just say it? And I think the president's always had that kind of refreshing candor. But I do think you're seeing a return to the axes of evil. You've got China flexing its muscles. You've got North Korea that's in a way diversifying away from its dependence on China, in this case, by cozying up with the Russians, by helping the Russians with the war in Ukraine, sending soldiers even. And then you've got, of course, the third part of the axis of evil, or the fourth part, which is Iran, who's incredibly weakened thanks to the United States and Israel, and specifically President Trump. But they're just demonstrating that they're going to continue with this resistance to the West. And in spite of their essentially defeat at the hands of the U.S. and Israel, they're going to stick with it and stick with the axes of evil. And so it's difficult to watch. Nobody's happy about it. But on the other hand, we shouldn't be surprised.
Do you think it might prompt a bit of a rethink by the Trump administration? I mean, let's not forget, during his first term, President Trump was trying to win over Kim Jong-un, and now it looks like he's got an even bigger nuclear arsenal than he did before that dialogue started. And then we saw President Trump's attempts to reach out to President Putin. He got a warm welcome in Alaska. And since then, we've seen President Putin completely defying President Trump, escalating attacks on civilians in Ukraine and stalling the talks that President Trump thought were going to happen soon. I mean, will there be a rethink?
I think there will be. I'm quite sure President Trump is capable of pivoting on issues. He reads the room. He understands what's going on. He's not thinking in 2019 or 20 terms. He's not even thinking about the summit in Alaska, because things have changed since then. So, I wouldn't be surprised to see a positive outcome from this ultimately, but not without some speed bumps along the way. But I think President Trump is demonstrating, the old argument, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. So he does reach out to North Korea, to China, to Russia. But on the other hand, he's quite, he understands that they can't really be trusted. It's not even trust but verify, but it's distrust and definitely verify. So, we could see some outcomes here. I think, again, it's a speed bump, but this is sort of also a demonstration in a way of weakness, that the 3 or 4 axes of evil have to cozy up with each other and have these silly parades and try to flex their muscles collectively. And then you have kind of the sideshow of Armenia and Azerbaijan and the other Central Asian countries. But I do think they have to understand that geographically, they are, much closer to Russia and China than the United States is. So they have to sort of play both sides of the fence. But I don't think there's I don't think this is a realignment in the sense that, back to the Cold War, like when it was, the Soviet Union versus the West. Russia's much weakened. The only thing they have is 4,500 nuclear warheads and a really disturbed leader who's not afraid to burn through 30,000 troops a month. You've got, anywhere from 200 to 300,000 dead Russians, and Putin doesn't seem to care. So that's something that is really difficult to compete with. But again, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Yeah, we've been talking quite a bit this week about the Prime Minister of India being there in China, as he was at the SOC summit on Monday in Tianjin. And, India, by being there and, holding hands with, I should add, and talk about a special relationship with Vladimir Putin, seems to be sending a message to President Trump, who has obviously slapped pretty hefty tariffs on India. And I think the message we're getting from the commentators in India is, don't try bullying us, because we've got actually quite a lot of quite powerful partners out there. And I'm just wondering whether it looks like the wrong moment to have picked that particular battle between Washington and New Delhi.
Yeah, of course, we wish that New Delhi would just side up with us and be on our team. We've always felt that way. But look, they've always run both sides. They've always kind of managed that relationship, with Russia, with China. They have some real, historical aversions to being too close to China. But I think with Russia and the U.S., they've always kind of struck that balance. But look, they've gone from importing 1% of their oil requirements from Russia to somewhere in 45 to 50% of their oil is coming from Russia. That's a massive escalation in terms of, whereas China's only gone from 13% to 16%. So, India doesn't really have a great argument to make here. And the U.S. can put more sanctions on Russia. They can stop the shipping of Russian oil to India. That will really affect things. I mean, nobody wants this trade situation to escalate. But on the other hand, there's a lot of arrows in the quiver for President Trump. And I think you'll see some significant sanctions on Russia and trading partners of Russia. So, it's still early stage here, but I'm guessing he's got a few more tricks up his sleeve.
Yeah, I mean, the Indians are upset. They're angry, and we've got that. We've heard that loud and clear firsthand from that side. And some commentators are saying, attacks, as perceived by India, i.e. those 50% tariffs on allies, which India obviously has been, and as well as desecrating U.S. aid policy, dividing and, somehow undermining some of America's traditional allies, like in Europe. I mean, basically all of this spells a big gift to China and Russia. I mean, do you think there's any sense to be made out of that?
I think that was an argument that was made by the president's critics during the campaign and at the beginning of his term. And it's funny how it all works out. The president does something that's unorthodox or provocative, and 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 months later, everything works out. There's a significant amount of trade deals that have been made around the world. He's settled 5 or 6 different armed conflicts, including between several of the participants in this Tianjin conference. And so, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, it is kind of funny how it's working out. The outcomes are what's important to President Trump. How he gets there is somewhat upsetting to people. But I do think that, this again shows that ultimately the United States will have the upper hand. Look how it worked out with Europe. Yes, they are our allies. He had to threaten tariffs. He had to, sort of encourage them to increase their, NATO spending. NATO is more powerful now than it was. And you have the European Union buying $750 billion of LNG from the United States. That's something India should be doing too. If you have a choice, it's a global market. You can buy from America. You can buy from other providers. You don't have to buy from Russia in spite of the discounted pricing they get.
I think I know the answer to this already, but do you think there's any truth in this put out by one analyst who wrote, for more than 70 years, the United States has led an international order organized around alliances, an open global economy and multilateralism. Today, it hangs by a thread. Any truth in that?
No, there's not, because there were flaws with that system. And, it wasn't, yes, there were a number of different alliances. There were a number of different trade organizations like the European Union. But I do think there were some flaws with that, notably that the American worker was being displaced by cheap and slave labor from China. And then, of course, Europe was running trade deficits with China as well. How did Europe overcome or make up for those deficits with China? They had a big trade surplus with the United States. So, essentially the U.S. taxpayer has been funding the development of countries like China and funding the defense and their 6 weeks holidays in France and the free healthcare in the United Kingdom, as well as defending the Europeans from the Soviet Union. So I think there's just a point where the trade system seemed to be working out for those benefiting from it. But when 50% of Americans don't own, public equities, and 50% of Americans are, paycheck to paycheck because these Rust Belt towns have been rotted out, I think, that it needed to be fixed. It's actually going to be better. And that's what's important to keep in mind. The trade system will improve because it will be more fair. And I think that's what President Trump is getting at.
It's good to hear that President Trump is active on social media. And, we've been reading his messages in the last day or two, showing that he's very much alive and well, because there were some rumors swirling around that he wasn't. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I'll quote the president here. Fake news, absolutely fake news. The president's busy. It doesn't mean he doesn't sneak in a few rounds of golf at one of his resorts on weekends. But I've been in Washington all week. There's absolutely no truth to any of that. I've talked to people who've been with the president, and no, he's alive and well, as we learned yesterday in the press conference.
Yeah, exactly. He was asked in that press conference, said he'd been very busy. I mean, you say he'd been playing a bit of golf, but what's he been up to?
Well, yeah, I mean, he had he's been very busy with dealing with some domestic issues here, notably, crime in the big cities. That's been a real front page issue here in the United States. He's done a great job with cleaning up Washington, D.C., which was, really going through a rough patch in terms of the crime problems here. And then he's reached out to other cities in the U.S., notably Chicago, where I have a home. And I could tell you it's a very dangerous place. And so we've had 40,000 homicides in Chicago since 1962. That's almost as many men as we lost in Vietnam. It's much safer in war zones like in Iraq and Afghanistan than it is in Chicago for an 18 to 25-year-old male. So, yeah, some things are still broken in the U.S., and the president's doing his best to fix them.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas, thank you very much indeed.
Great to see you, Tom. Thanks.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Dr. Victor Gao, who is the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, who joins us from Beijing. Dr. Gao, always a pleasure talking to you. We were looking at pictures before we crossed to you of that impressive parade in Tiananmen Square, and I gather you were there doing live commentary on that parade. I mean, what was the mood like? Describe it for us.
First of all, it's a very solemn occasion, but also very joyful occasion. And it drew attention not only for all the people gathered on the square, but throughout China, as well as throughout many countries in the world. And I think the overall message is very clear. China becomes a very powerful force, protecting peace and promoting peace. This is very important. China has declared that it wants to be on peaceful terms with every country, and the Chinese way of development is based on building up peace. But promoting peace doesn't mean that China will tolerate any other country to play a hegemonistic role against other countries, try to issue ultimatum to other countries. China wants to promote a world order based on equality of all member states of the United Nations, rather than allowing any country to dominate above all the other countries. This is the clear message from this parade.
Okay, I mean, for a lot of people around the world, and you've already suggested that there are two audiences here, there's a domestic audience and an international audience. For the international audience, it was those images of President Xi Jinping, your president, President Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un standing side by side. I mean, what does that image, do you think, say to the world?
Well, I think the overall image is much bigger than the three heads of state, because we have about 27 heads of states and heads of government from all these 27 countries. And then if you count a deputy prime minister, foreign minister, and ministers of all kinds, special presidential envoy, you actually have more than 50 countries represented, plus all the foreign countries' ambassadors to China, the UN representatives in China, other organizations throughout the world represented in this parade. I think more than 100 countries were represented for this parade. So zooming in on three leaders out of this more than 100 countries represented in this parade is a little bit too selective. So I don't think we need to read too much into it, but President Vladimir Putin was designated as the VIP #1. That's also for sure, because China, Russia, ever since 1991, has enjoyed a very good neighborly relations with each other, respecting each other. And our long border of 4,300 kilometers long, ever since 1991, has been unarmed. And it has become an enabler for very frequent and large amounts of people-to-people exchanges across the two sides of the border. So it's not surprising that Vladimir Putin was the VIP #1, but he is first among all the equals, and all the other heads of states and heads of government have been accorded the red carpet treatment and have been given full recognition as the representative of their own country.
You were there, Dr. Gao, so you obviously had a much closer view than I did here in the Middle East. But the images that I saw playing out live, and perhaps it was just the moments that I was tuned into, I mean, there was a definite exchange and a moment in which President Xi was flanked by Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. I don't know if that was just for the cameras or whether that was just whether he was flanked by other people during the course of the day. And they seemed to be talking, they seemed to be having an exchange, and I was wondering to myself, what language are they speaking to each other, given that I wouldn't have thought they had one language in common? Perhaps you can enlighten us. But you see what I mean? I mean, that's a striking image.
Well, yes, indeed. I think that group picture was taken when all these leaders of the various countries walked up the rank to the Tiananmen Gate before the whole parade started. And I think there was an interpreter behind President Xi Jinping and behind President Vladimir Putin, who most likely would translate between Chinese and Russian. And whether there was also an interpreter behind Mr. Kim, I do not know. But I understand Mr. Kim actually speaks good, fluent French, as well as some level of English. So I think one interpreter probably would serve the purpose of communicating, helping communications between President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, as well as Mr. Kim of DPRK. So it's not surprising. They can communicate, and they enjoy that moment when they were both on their way up to the gate before the parade started.
Just listening to some of the things said by President Xi, he said that today humanity is faced with the choice of peace or war. That's what he said, dialogue or confrontation. And I'm just wondering, where does China see the biggest threat of war?
Well, I would say the greatest threat to peace and the future development of mankind is some country try to play solo, try to pretend that it is the sole polarity in the world, which is completely in contradiction to the world order established back in 1945, because the world order established back then was not for unipolarity. It was meant for multipolarity, reflected in the composition of the United Nations Security Council's permanent members, each with a veto power. That means the founding fathers of the United Nations actually were thinking about checks and balances with the aim of preventing another global world war, at least among and between permanent member states of the United Nations. Therefore, multipolarity was built into the origin of the international order established back in 1945. But the fact that one single big power, or the superpower as it calls itself, wants to play solo and try to divide countries into different opposing blocs, that is a recipe for disaster. And I think we really need to remind everyone in the world about the origin of multipolarity, multilateralism, established not today, but back in 1945. And the fact that the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, and formerly the Soviet Union and the United States were all permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council really speak a lot about this multipolarity. We need to bring the world order, the chaos in the world order today, back to the original intent of the founding fathers of the United Nations.
Dr. Gao, just listening to you there, and also listening to what President Xi said earlier on today when he said, China is a great nation that is never intimidated by bullies. Reading between the lines of what you're saying, reading between the lines of what President Xi is saying, are you by any chance talking about the United States?
Well, I would say today's parade, the victory parade, most likely will be judged by future generations as a turning point in the world. Why? Because throughout this parade, China has demonstrated to the fullest extent possible that China now possesses the most sophisticated weapons you can think about, conventional weapons as well as nuclear weapons. And in terms of the conventional weapons, it is completely minimum on a par with the United States. And the United States no longer has any advantages over the Chinese military forces. In terms of the nuclear power, China actually has enough wherewithal to deal a fatal blow to any country which dares to impose a nuclear war on China. Meaning, China's military buildup is not for warmongering, is only intended for protecting peace for China as well as protecting peace for mankind. That means whichever country or blocks of countries or groups of countries in the world which dare to think about war against China will be courting their own destruction, because China only cares about preserving peace, protecting peace, whether the threat to peace that we have in mind comes from the United States or countries allied with the United States. It doesn't matter. China will fiercely defend the peace for itself, for mankind as a whole, regardless wherever this menace comes from. So I hope all the capital cities in the world will really listen very carefully, and they will check out all the advanced technologies, equipments of all kinds for space, for air force, for ground force, for naval force, as well as for submarines, as well as all the very sophisticated digital applications and the AI enabling devices all together. What China has built up to demonstrate it today is a seamless killing machine to deter any military threat imposed by any country or any group of country on China. And China is now generally considered, rightfully I would say, the major defender of peace and free trade in the world. This is the moment of truth. This is the most convincing conviction I've come across after watch this parade in person. And I want to share my observation with the rest of the world.
No, well, it's good to have your first-hand visions and testimony on that. I mean, I was looking at those pictures, admittedly, on a television screen, and looking at these autonomous weapons, these underwater drones, the lasers. I mean, a grand display of power, as you say. And China says, and you're saying, this is all for defensive purposes. I'm wondering if it looks like that to people in Taiwan.
I think for people in Taiwan, this should be the moment of joy because, one of the contributions after defeating Japanese fascism was the restoration of Taiwan back to China, dictated by the Cairo Declaration as well as the Potsdam Proclamation. But therefore, the principle of one China and Taiwan being part of China was carved in stone as a legacy of defeating Japanese fascism. And who defeated Japanese fascism? It's the United States, China, and the former Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. We worked together. We shed blood together. We fought shoulder to shoulder, back to back, in defeating Japanese fascism. And China earned its right to become a permanent member state of the United Nations Security Council on the one hand, and restoring Taiwan back to China. So for people in Taiwan, and many of them were actually descendants from the more than 1 million soldiers that Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek brought with him when he fled mainland China and settled down in Taiwan. So it should be their moment of joy and exhilaration because the celebration we made for the war heroes and the 35 million Chinese who fell in the Second World War were their forefathers. Their blood was shed by their forefathers, and the contributions and the medals earned were their forefathers' medals. We are the same people. We are the same species. We are bound together by the same culture, by the same civilization, by the same lineage. So any Taiwan separatists who claim that people in Taiwan are not Chinese are kind of equivalent of saying that people in England who are English are not British by their citizenship. It's completely illogical, completely berserk, I would say. So I would say today's celebration is a celebration for the 23 million people in Taiwan. The victory we earned back in 1945 was the victory of the people in Taiwan. They deserve the full recognition as much as everyone else on China's mainland.
Okay, well, I wasn't alone in watching that parade today from the outside world. I suspect, I don't know for sure, that President Trump was watching it as well, because in the early hours of this morning, Middle Eastern time, he was putting out messages on social media. One of the things he said indirectly to your President Xi Jinping, he said, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." I'm sure you saw that too. How do you decode that reaction from the President of the United States?
First of all, I think President Trump really thought too much. He thought about other countries conspiring against the interests of the United States. I always say, whereas China is always worried that if we do not have enough friends, the United States, especially the United States under President Trump, seem to be worried that they do not have enough enemies in the world. So I hope they will reverse this mentality. They will try to befriend as many people, as many countries as possible, as what we do here in China. Now, secondly, I would say President Trump could have made the right decision to come to Beijing to attend the September the 3rd military parade. We call it Victory Parade because the United States really contributed a lot in the final defeat of Japanese fascism together with China. But also allow me to make one point. China started this war against Japanese aggression as early as in 1931. For about 10 years before Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, China fought against the Japanese aggressors more or less by itself, solo. Nobody was really helping China. And the fact that the United States declared war on Japan after Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor really helped accelerate and culminate the victory against Japan in 1945. But the point I want to make is, even if the United States did not declare war on Japan, the Chinese nation will continue to fight against the Japanese aggressor until every soldier on the Japanese side would need to be expelled from China. Why? Let me tell you, the Japanese fascism not only want to kill the Chinese people, they want to eliminate the Chinese culture. They want to completely obliterate the Chinese civilization, which has been here for more than 5,000 years. How could any Japanese fascist expect that the Chinese nation, including my forefathers, would ever tolerate such maximum pressure against the Chinese nation? No, the Chinese nation will stand up firmly, uphold their own sovereignty, defending their own culture and civilization. And the fact that the Americans really joined the fight against the Japanese aggressors was a blessing to the Chinese nation. We are always grateful for the fight, flying tigers, the Doolittle raiders who eventually landed in many parts of China, saved by the Chinese civilians who mostly, huge number of them, lost their lives at the brutality of the Japanese aggressor. I think those should be the shining moments of history shared by China and the United States. So for President Trump, if he could have made it to the Tiananmen Square, he would be probably the guest of honor number one, on a par with President Vladimir Putin, and that probably would have done more justice to the celebration of victory over Japanese fascism. But the fact that he didn't make it to Beijing was a pity, but for him to whine and weep about, for example, China, Russia, and DPRK standing together is a little bit too much. And I hope he would spend his time more constructively elsewhere. And hopefully one day, President Trump will make it to Beijing when we next time celebrate the victory over Japanese fascism again in the future for another grand parade.
Well, clearly the world is a very different place today from 1945. But I just want to pick up on what you were saying there. You're saying that President Trump was invited today, but he turned down the invitation to attend the parade. Is that right?
I do not know the details. I think there were indications that the two countries were talking about President Trump's proposed visit to China. President Trump insisted he wanted to come to China on many occasions, sometimes very hastily, sometimes very hectically, for example. But whether China invited him for the parade, I do not know. But I'm sure the Chinese government and the American government have been engaged in discussions about when and how President Trump's wish to visit China could be satisfied. But the fact that he didn't make it on today's grand parade was, in my view, a pity. And sooner or later, I'm sure President Trump will make it to Beijing. When it will be, under what circumstance, whether it will be a state visit on the sideline of another international event, for example, APEC summit meeting in Seoul or somewhere in Republic of Korea, I do not know. But I think China's door to welcome President Trump's visit to China is always open, and I hope he can make it and really elevate China-US bilateral relations to a new height.
To summarize this section of the conversation, I mean, how would you say Beijing, your colleagues in the government in China, how do you think they would characterize their impression of diplomacy under this second Trump administration? What sort of words would they use? What adjectives spring to mind?
Well, I would say it is generally felt that the reliability in the world of today is the unreliability of President Trump and his government. The predictability in the world of today is the unpredictability of President Trump and his government. Now, this is actually very dangerous because normally for a very powerful, very large, very militarily influential country like the United States, we want to expect that the leadership of the United States is highly reliable, highly predictable, and always means what it says and says what it means when it says it. But it seems that the United States keeps changing, keeps jumping back and forth, and you can never tell what the United States is really up to. And for every utterance of President Trump, you really need to spend tons of time to really decipher it, to see whether he really means it. He normally say, I may not. I can do that, or I do not need to do that. So he keeps the whole world guessing as to what exactly he is all about. This is the danger of the world of today. I hope President Trump will be highly predictable, highly reliable, and highly trustworthy, rather than unreliable, unpredictable, a little bit capricious, and that hopefully will be changed in the coming years when President Trump remains the head of state and the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military forces for all the time up to January 2029.
It's quite interesting to see Kim Jong-un there in Beijing today, because President Trump has suggested that perhaps he will meet him again. They met twice during the first Trump presidency. But if they do meet again, they're going to meet on quite different terms, aren't they? Because we saw today Kim Jong-un flanked by two extremely powerful men, your president being one and the president of Russia being another one. I mean, he's no longer going to be viewed as, quote, little rocket man by President Trump, is he?
Well, allow me to say the real thing. For the three previous meetings between President Trump, 1.0, and Mr. Kim, the ultimate leader of DPRK, China provided a lot of help and enabled each and all of the three previous meetings between President Trump and Mr. Kim. Now, that means China really wanted to see rapprochement between the United States and DPRK. China wanted to do whatever that is the right thing to make sure that President Trump and Mr. Kim will meet again. So that is the megatrend, I would say. Mr. Kim never operated solo because China and DPRK still have whatever that remains of the kind of defense treaty between the two countries. Therefore, from the US perspective, don't dismiss Mr. Kim, the paramount leader of DPRK, because DPRK does not stand alone, does not exist in a vacuum. DPRK has a lot of solidarity from China, and in more recent years, DPRK has really improved its relations with Russia significantly, pushing it to a new level of analysis. So I hope President Trump will meet with Mr. Kim as soon as possible, talk about peace, talk about change the realities on the Korean Peninsula, because there was only an armistice agreement signed back in 1953. There was never a peace treaty signed. And I think for stability to really become carved in stone on the Korean Peninsula, we need everyone's help. China, Russia, the United States, especially focusing on DPRK on the one hand, and ROK on the other hand, and to a lesser extent, of course, Japan. We should all participate in making sure that peace will be everlasting and war should never be considered as a possibility for the situation involving the Korean Peninsula.
And just lastly, Dr. Gao, before we wrap up, I mean, you've used the word peace several times in this conversation. It's encouraging to hear that. And yet there's a conflict we haven't talked about. You know, Russia invaded Ukraine. Overnight, 500 Russian drones were fired into Ukraine, 24 missiles during the course of the night, striking mostly civilian infrastructure. I mean, why doesn't China show some of the influence it surely exerts over Russia and promote peace? Because that seems to be eluding all parties at the moment.
Allow me to make 2 points. I think during the Alaska summit taking place on August the 15th between President Trump and President Vladimir Putin, President Putin actually said one thing. He said, if President Trump were the president of the United States back in 2023, the war in Ukraine should have never happened. Now, President Trump, of course, welcomed this, but I think President Vladimir Putin did have a point. The war was very tragic, very much of a very sad chapter in human history, but the war should have been an avoidable war to start with. Now, having said that, what we need to do collectively is to put an end to this war. And China called on both Russia and Ukraine to stop the war from day one after the war broke out. And China has never changed this position. China does not have a vested interest in the continuation of this war. So we call on all the European countries, EU in particular, NATO as an organization, to really put their acts together to stop the war in Ukraine, rather than pouring more fuel onto the fire in this war, because the war will never end in the defeat of Russia. Why? Because Russia holds two kinds of different weapons in their hands. Conventional weapon they want to use to defeat Ukraine on the one hand, but nuclear weapons in case any of the NATO member states, any of the major powers in Europe, or before Trump, if the United States want to really go into war against Russia inside Ukraine or strike Russia from inside Ukraine. So the possibility of escalation from conventional war in Ukraine to a larger nuclear war involving many parts of Europe or even the United States or even the rest of the world should not be excluded. We should stop this war as quickly as possible. China is doing the right thing, and I'm pretty sure history will look back upon whatever that had happened between 2022 to 2025 and come to the conclusion that China is on the right side of history by calling for an end to this Ukraine war from day one and has never changed this position. China is still calling for an immediate end to this war. The world will be blessed if China's advice is really taken into consideration. And I'm pretty sure President Xi Jinping would have told President Putin the same message during his very high quality meetings with President Putin here in Beijing, as well as in Tianjin during the SCO summit.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate your time and your contribution. Dr. Victor Gao, thank you very much indeed, sir.
Very much for having me. Thank you.
Well, the US President Donald Trump isn't just focused on China, he's also been taking aim at India as well. He recently slammed America's trade relationship with India as being one-sided. And experts warn he's quickly building up more foes. Well, at the Beijing summit, the Chinese President Xi Jinping welcomed Prime Minister Narendra Modi with the same energy and enthusiasm he showed for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Well, President Trump's 50% tariff on Indian imports has shaken decades of US efforts to keep India and China apart. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi are already pledging closer ties. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to General Syed Atta Hasnain, who joins us from New Delhi. General Hasnain, it's a pleasure talking to you, and we've spoken before, so welcome back to the program. I want to start by talking to you about the summit in Tianjin in China, at which your Prime Minister Narendra Modi was present, and he was perhaps feeling rather angered while he was there by the tariffs that had been imposed upon India by the Trump administration. Some analysts saying that the message he was sending by being there is that India is a powerful country, it's got some influential friends in the world, and that was visible for all to see. Do you think that's true?
Well, not really. I won't agree with that analogy. The SCO is an annual summit which takes place. There are the main countries, Russia, India, China, Pakistan. Iran has recently joined it, and of course all the Central Asian countries. They get together. It's not really a security related group. It's a group for all kinds of consultations, security, trade, economic cooperation, etc., etc. Now, it's an important grouping because these three major countries, Russia, India, and China, come together on that. We've had some very interesting instances in this past when in Tashkent, for example, 2 years ago, there was a time when the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, spoke to Mr. Putin and advised him against the war in Ukraine at that particular time. And that was the first time that someone had actually spoken down to Mr. Putin and advised him so. It created a lot of interest around the world. Now, the issue here was Mr. Modi was traveling to China after 7 long years. He had been in China last in 2018, and in the intervening period, we've had Galwan, we've had the Pangong So, the whole episode in eastern Ladakh, and the standoff with China, and of course, recently the standoff with Pakistan. The interesting aspect of it also is that we are continuing with the issue with the United States as far as the tariffs are concerned and what is perceived to be a deteriorating relationship at the moment. Having said that, this is the backdrop with which this conference was being held. Did people expect that Mr. Modi would not go there? I don't really think so. Whatever the situation was, I think well before Operation Sindoor, a kind of a thaw between India and China had already emerged. They met at the BRICS conference, the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese President earlier, 6-8 months ago. And that was the beginning of the reset of the relationship. So Mr. Modi was anyway expected to go there. And it's an important conference at this particular juncture when you're finding all of a sudden a gray zone in the international order, a resetting kind of taking place, not yet emerged completely. So I think in the midst of this, Mr. Modi would definitely not have been found missing in such an important conference. He was there to make a statement, yes, to send a message that we have good friends, that we are a democracy, we are autonomous, we respect our own strategic autonomy, we respect our relationship with the United States, but equally we have friends in Russia and we are resetting our relationship with China. I think all these messages were going out together.
Okay, so a coherent message there to an administration that has people in it in Washington like Peter Navarro, a White House trade advisor, who I think must have created some pretty major ripples in India, knowing the country as I do and reading between the lines. He said India is fueling Russia's war machine by buying Russian oil. And then he made this curious comment about Brahmins profiteering. And I wonder what's been the reaction to comments like that? What do you think he's getting at here?
Surprisingly, I would have expected much more negativity in India. But I think after the experience of the last 6 months, especially after all that's happened in Operation Sindoor and the standoff with the United States, so not really a standoff, but all this issue of the tariffs, etc., I think India has also got a little hardened. The leadership, the civil society, etc., even the media is not so sensational at the moment. So all these various statements being made out by Peter Navarro are being taken in their stride at the moment, commented upon, and no one is taking it to heart completely. And there's a couple of reasons for it. I was questioned this yesterday on a very interesting show with one of India's leading commentators, social media persons, TV personalities, Ms. Barkha Dutt. She asked me this same question, and I explained to her. I said this is the time of information warfare. This is the time of narratives, and the United States is overplaying its narratives. If you go into the history of Steve Navarro, what is his name?
Peter Navarro.
Peter Navarro, yeah. Peter Navarro, if you go into the history of Peter Navarro, I don't think he has ever said a word against India in the past ever. All of a sudden he emerges one fine day and starts speaking all kinds of things about India. Do I have to believe it? Yes, a lot of people in the world are looking at it, but I don't think the credibility of this is very high. India is got a certain credibility in the international community, which is not being affected by this. To say that India is in bed with China and Russia, that we are the one who are fueling this war. Okay, people in Europe may be feeling it, but I don't think the leadership in Europe or anywhere else is also perceiving it in that manner. This seems to be a reasonably immature kind of a narrative play out by the deep state in the United States, if you ask me. Okay. And I think this is something which is only in the passing. It is not going to stay very long. And that's the way India is actually handling it. And I think that's a very mature way of looking at it.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, I mean, another thing that's being reported is that President Trump's claims, and this is something we've talked about with other guests during this week as well, I'd love to get your opinion. President Trump has claimed that he was instrumental in resolving the tensions between India and Pakistan back in May, when we spoke last, in fact. And he's been demanding a Nobel Peace Prize for those interventions. And it's being reported that that's really angered New Delhi. New Delhi is losing patience with this narrative. Do you think that's true?
Well, there are lots of versions of this. And one of the versions is what you have just said. I do think that India is a little peeved. I'm not angry, a little peeved. A relative degree of immaturity which is coming out from the various voices which are coming from the United States at this time. A superpower with an economy of, well, how much, 23 trillion or whatever it is. I mean, it's looking at the whole world. The currency of the United States, the dollar rules the whole world. I mean, we need to look at this a little more maturely, and the United States needs to look at it a little more maturely. Okay, if you brought peace between two nations and one of the nations is not too comfortable about you're bleating about it all over the place, then just keep quiet on it. But it is Indian policy. I mean, we respect the Shimla Agreement of 1972, which says everything is going to be bilateral. India and Pakistan are supposed to resolve their problems bilaterally. It's one of the reasons why India doesn't go around talking in the world about this. We don't mention the word Kashmir in the United Nations General Assembly. I don't think you've ever heard us saying that, except in the context of something which Pakistan may have raised. Right? So to expect that Mr. Modi is going to agree that the war or this standoff of 88 hours was brought to an end by a third party is something which won't gel. Even if it may be true, I don't know. None of us can say what it was. No one is a witness to it. But I don't think that really gels. And India, and I think Mr. Modi and his party and the government are only following a policy which has always existed in India.
Just looking sort of more broadly at the sort of global order, and then looking at what's been happening in China this week and the sorts of people who've been attending the summits, the parades, and all the other major events that were held there in China. I mean, when you think of how under strain world relations are right now, do you think we are looking at the beginnings of a new world order?
Well, we have been seeking a new world order ever since I can remember. I mean, after the Cold War, we've been looking at it. So, and the new order has always been in emergence, but somehow never crystallized as the way one would have expected it. But post-COVID, yes, post-COVID, there has been a difference in what we saw from, let's say, 1991 till about 2020 or 21. That's about 30 years, when we saw global terror taking over the whole world. The United States going into Afghanistan, into Iraq, trying to defeat global terror, trying to create homeland security in a big way, looking at much of the world and with suspicion in terror terms, etc. These were different things. COVID came to put an end to global terror virtually at that time. I'm not saying it's completely receded, very much there. But Ukraine came. The attempt to push towards into Russia, eastwards into Russia, was resisted, pushed back by the Russians, and the war in Ukraine came about. Put Europe on the back foot virtually economically in a big way, militarily in a big way also. At the same time, what happened in the Middle East with what happened on October the 7th, you found a new war emerging there, which has resulted in a defeat, virtually a defeat of most of the proxies who have been fighting Israel, and Israel is relentlessly going after Gaza and the Palestinians, thinking that force will ultimately resolve every issue. Now, I think all this is in a melting pot at the moment, and no one can say that a crystallized world order is emerging. I don't think we are anywhere near it at the moment. India, in the middle of all this, you see, most of the bigger powers, the powers with the bigger economies, etc., have got reasonably set orders. They are part of certain groupings or something or the other. Japan, Australia, Europe, Russia, China, the United States. Only if you look at it, India is the only country in the middle which is equidistant from almost everyone. And it has followed its strategic autonomy all along in this manner. I don't think India can be bullied into change or looking at what it has been pursuing in terms of its own strategic and its own particular national interests. I don't think India is going to move away from that. Mr. Modi has made it very clear many, many times. And he's a strong leader. A strong leader of that kind will not perhaps relent on these issues. So, being one of those countries which is equidistant from almost all the power blocks of the world, India could be also called a swing power. In many ways, it's also a swing power. So we are looking at our national interests and aligning with the side wherever in a particular domain it comes to our advantage in terms of our interests, strategic interests. And that's the Indian policy. But as to the real answer to your question as to whether we are on the threshold of a new world order, well, I don't think yet. It is going to take more time.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that it will happen in Mr. Trump's time so easily, because the United States, which is one of the driving forces behind everything, is somehow in a very constrained kind of a situation today, not very clear about which way or which direction it wants to ultimately head. So I think that's a typical gray zone kind of a situation which is there in the world today, and that's going to stay for the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. General Hasnain, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.